Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for a blueprint for the movement, transforming moments into a momentum, held in honor of the National Day of Racial Healing, which is a day dedicated to acknowledging racism's harms and fostering dialogue, understanding, and collective action to create a more just and equitable society. We are so happy to have the author David L. Crane here with us today. My name is Dr. Shalita Camarda Webb, and I'll be serving as your moderator for today's conversation. Whether you're in whether you're in a watch party with your classes and students like Dr. Michelle Torregano or watching individually, we're grateful that you've chosen to spend your time here with us today. This year marks the 10th anniversary of the National Day of Racial Healing, a moment to pause, reflect, and to recommit ourselves to a shared humanity. Today's message invites us to reflect on a movement that was never about the past, but about the urgent present. Leaders like Rosa Parks and John Lewis often noted they weren't trying to make history. They simply stood up for what was right in the moment to secure basic human dignity. With that, I ask us to consider a couple of questions. How do those lessons of leadership and citizenship translate into our daily lives? And what does this moment ask of us as we work toward a more just and equitable society? Before we begin, just a few housekeeping notes. This is a Zoom webinar, so attendees are in listening only mode. Please feel free to use the question and answering function or chat throughout today's event to submit your questions. Today's program will include a presentation by our guest, as well as a fireside chat style question and response. And we'll do our best to reserve the last final moments for Q&A. Also, please watch out for live polls throughout the session. This will let us know who's in the space, as well as invite everyone into the conversation um, about building movements and advancing racial history. Lastly, this recording will be shared, the Zoom webinar will be recorded and be posted to the PennWest YouTube page. So with that, let's begin with the poll. Please respond if you're individual by who's in the room, by sharing who's in the room. I'll give you about 10 seconds to do so. Thank you. You'll see there's a mixture, of course, of for those of you responding individually of faculty, students, and some alum. Thank you for taking this poll. So now to introduce our speaker. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, David L. Crane, who's the author of Making the Movement, How Activists Fought for Civil Rights with buttons, flyers, pens, and posters. And he's also the founder of Making the Movement Civil Rights Museum, a traveling exhibition about the material culture of the civil rights movement. A partial exhibit was featured at the Baron Forness Library on the Edinburgh campus in November and December of 2025. Founded in 2013, the museum's collection consists of artifacts from emancipation to the 21st century. These objects were not souvenirs, they were the nonviolent weapons that fought Jim Crow. Crane received BAs in history and political science from the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, and a master's in library and with my master's in library and informational science from the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. He's also the author of Become as One People, Colonial Identifications for Native Americans in the Carolinas from 1540 to 1790, and has contributed to textbooks such as Freedom on My Mind and A History of African Americans with Documents, Volumes 1 and 2. Before we turn things over to David, we'd like to start with a brief poll to ground his remarks by asking participants how they engage with the work. As you can see, there's a number of ways, whether it's through their role academically or personally that folks are engaging this work. And it's good to know that many of us are out there doing the work actively and ongoingly. Without further ado, I bring to you David L. Crane.
Thank you so much, Shalita. It's a real pleasure to be here with you and students and faculty, alumni, and the public. It's just great to be back with PennWest Edinburgh. I had such a great experience when I visited and spoke in person. Spoke with a couple classes, and everyone was so warm and friendly despite the weather. And the questions were so spot on, and people were engaged, and I really hope to continue that engagement with everybody today. So, if it's okay with you, I'll just jump into the presentation, and we can kind of go from there. Right? Everyone seeing me okay here, slideshow wise? All right, I'll take that as a yes. Um, so today we're going to be talking about the material culture of the civil rights movement. I am David L. Crane. I'm the founder of Making the Movement Civil Rights Museum. It's a traveling exhibition about the material culture of the civil rights movement. I'm also the author of Making the Movement, How Activists Fought for Civil Rights with Buttons, Flyers, Pins, and Posters. I'm easy to contact. I'm on socials. Here's my website. I'm more than happy to follow up with questions, speak with students, researchers, activists. It's my pleasure to do so. Here's the book from Princeton Architectural Press in New York, and it is available at your favorite bookseller. One of the most important things that I try to get across to people when I'm speaking about the material culture of the civil rights movement is that these were not souvenirs. Uh, it feels retrospective to us now. And you can learn a lot about the civil rights movement, and you probably will today during this presentation. You can learn a lot about the civil rights movement and organizations and what people did through these objects. But we have to remember that this was not retrospective to them. This was immediate. These were the tools in the toolbox that activists had. I call them the nonviolent weapons that fought Jim Crow. These are used by the foot soldiers on the front lines of the civil rights movement. So, what they do, okay, broad strokes here. And I think this will be particularly helpful once we start talking about how this relates to the movement today. Look at this photo. I mean, it speaks so loudly. Imagine this exact same photo, but take away all of those signs, take away all of those buttons, and then think about the impact that these objects had. They help spread the word. These are people standing in the streets without the material culture. It lets people know what the objectives and the strategies of the movement are. People wore these around their hometowns to dinners, to organizations, to meetings. It helps recruit new members. Hey, I heard about that. Can you tell me a little bit more about it? How can I get involved? It helps raise money. People often sold these objects, or you got one for free if you paid your dues to an organization. Raising funds is key to every organization, and that's a part of the civil rights movement. It helped influence legislation. It's helped set goals and agendas. What's the purpose? Why are you marching for Selma? Well, hey, look, it's to raise attention for the passage of the Voting Rights Act. So it's not symbolic acts. There's always a trajectory. These have to be part of a much broader movement, and the material culture is a key point in that broader strategy. It can be practical. Hey, there's a march coming up. We need you to print 1,000 flyers. Let's make some buttons. Let's people wear them before, during, and after those marches and protests. And ultimately, once people see these things in multiple locations, people wearing them in public, seeing them reproduced in photos, it changes people's minds and hopefully helps them support the movement's objectives. Just very briefly, and we'll go through each one of these in a slide or two. But the reason I like to show this from the very beginning is that material culture was a part of the entire movement. I know for a lot of people, civil rights movement means this 1960s maybe, or Brown to the Voting Rights Act or something like that. But one of the things that I want to show people is that the material culture of the civil rights movement has always been a key component and therefore always will be. You see Booker T. Washington there. This is taken in 1921, and you'll notice each member is wearing a badge, as they called it back then. So this is a CDV, a carte de visite, about the Emancipation Proclamation. So from its very earliest origins, material culture was a part of the civil rights movement. And whatever your definition of the civil rights movement is, and I know that varies tremendously, material culture was a key component of the strategy of those involved in the movement, from abolitionism and emancipation to mutual aid societies and fighting the origins of Jim Crow, and to the establishment of the NAACP, the country's first specifically oriented civil rights organization. So, from its very origins in this country, material culture was key to the strategy of the movement. Um, I mean, take a look at this little button. I think I might even have it right here, or a version of it. This is how small it is. This is a blue version right here. Um, People would have worn them on their lapels, worn them to meetings. But think about what this little object is trying to accomplish. Y'all, lynching only became a federal crime 2 years ago. This was part of the NAACP's anti-lynching campaign in the 1920s, when there were 2 million members of the Ku Klux Klan. You also notice those little scars on top, right? I mean, we got to remember these are not souvenirs. We're learning about the movement as a result of seeing it now. But for them, this was a tool. This was a weapon. This could also be a bullseye for those who are wearing it. So think about the power and the significance of what a little object like this was playing, particularly in that early part of the movement. So World War II was a turning point in the civil rights movement. At first, most civil rights organizations were opposed to U.S. entry into the war. Hey, look, let's take care of democracy here in the United States before we try to defend it abroad. But once the United States entered the war, civil rights organizations quickly pivoted to linking the goals of the war effort, spreading democracy, making the world safe for democracy, ending white supremacist fascism across the world, and linking it to their goals in the United States. So the first place in American society to be sort of legally desegregated was the armed forces, not Brown in 1954. It happens during World War II with Executive Order 8802. That later became a piece of legislation passed by Congress, the Fair Employment Practices Act, which outlawed discrimination in the armed forces based on race and religion. And material culture, as always, was a part of spreading the word, raising awareness, pushing for legislation, At every point, it is a key factor in that broader strategy. This is one of my favorite artifacts in the collection. It just sums up everything that I'm trying to say about the significance of material culture. Look at the date here, 1946. Because of the concerted efforts of civil rights organizations and the participation of black soldiers in the war effort, membership in the NAACP went up by ninefold in those war years. So what are they saying with a little object like this? It's about the size of a nickel. Finish the fight. We defeated the Nazis. We're making the world safe for democracy. So let's finish the fight. Let's do that here in the United States. This is the first artifact I bought. Artifact in the civil rights movement. I bought this over 20 years ago. Um, I actually bought it on eBay. Okay. It was back then in the same category as lunchboxes and bobbleheads. It wasn't more than $20. And when it arrived and I held it in my hand, and these objects have a real power, especially when you're in the presence of them and you're holding them. Just as they had a power when they were used in public at the time. And when I held this little object in my hand, it kind of hit me like a thunderbolt. This little object, and it was the date, okay? People paid their membership dues to the NAACP, and you can draw a straight line between paying that membership due, this person receiving this pin in the mail, wearing it around town, wearing it to meetings, and that money is directly helping to fund Thurgood Marshall's legal team, which leads to school desegregation and the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954. So this little object, this simple pin, is key, fundamental to the strategy to fight Jim Crow. This is one of the very first incidences of people referring to the civil rights movement. We take for granted that, yes, there was this national movement across the country with broad coalitions of support called the civil rights movement that had clear objectives and strategies. That had to be created. That very notion of a national civil rights movement had to be created, and material culture was key to creating that. This is also where sort of the larger myth of Rosa Parks began. It depicts her as kind of a meek bystander caught up in events beyond her control. The reality is the complete opposite. She was a field secretary for the NAACP by this point. She was a long time activist by the time the Montgomery bus boycotts happened. But it's objects like this that help construct this notion of a movement. Now, for a lot of people, this is the civil rights movement. That period in the late 50s and the 1960s, and with good reason, because there was tremendous success and a growing support. The secret to that success is building a broad coalition of long-standing civil rights organizations like CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, the NAACP, working with largely newer and student-led organizations like SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So they're blending their organizations, they're coming together to set goals, larger strategies. What are the objectives of the civil rights movement? What are the best strategies to accomplish that? And as you can see in this photograph and those to come, material culture was central to every single one of those things. What are the goals? Material culture help with that. What are the strategies? How are we going to build broad coalitions? How are we going to raise funds? How are we going to work together to achieve those objectives. Material culture is central to that. Um, I live in North Carolina, about 20 miles away from Greensboro, where the sit-in movement began. Just yesterday, they started the sit-in movement, February the 1st, 1960. But it's not about just that day. It took another 6 months of direct action for one lunch counter in one store in one city to become desegregated. The importance is that it was a movement. The tactic spread. And rather than face sit-ins, many businesses and store owners got ahead of that and said, look, we'll just desegregate. That's what makes it a movement. That's what makes it so significant. And as you can see, it is material culture. It is the objects that people wore that spread the message, raise money, and create this shared sense of a movement that is spreading across the country. Same thing for the freedom rides. All they want to do is ride from DC to New Orleans, but they spent the summer in jail or the hospital. But it is objects like this that spread the word, push for legislation, put pressure on the Kennedy administration, which eventually outlawed segregation in interstate bus travel. So, as you can see, these objects, these nonviolent weapons, are key to the strategy of the civil rights movement. I know you've seen this photo. I know you've heard the speech. But have you noticed the button before? Now, hundreds of thousands of buttons and signs like this were made in anticipation of people wearing them at the march. And they did. But the purpose of the March on Washington was not a symbolic act. We're not just singing Kumbaya. The purpose of the March on Washington is to press for legislation. The Civil Rights Act, which was languishing in Congress. That's why people gathered. So it took almost a year after the march in 1963 for that legislation, that landmark legislation, to be passed. And material culture was key to that strategy. They make hundreds of thousands of these buttons. People wore them at the march, but they wore them home. That's why so many still exist. Hey, I saw that march on TV. I heard that speech. I read that article. I saw those buttons. I saw those signs. What's the purpose? Call your congressman. Put pressure on them. Ask them, we want you to pass this legislation. And material culture, even after the march, maybe more importantly, was key to that strategy. Here's a AP press photo. I've seen pictures of just stacks and piles of this material culture. So as you can see, and they don't make this on the day of. This is months and months and months in the development of the strategy, and material culture was key to that strategy. Same thing. Once Civil Rights Act is passed, it's key to another pillar of knocking down Jim Crow, disenfranchisement. It's key to the strategy of Freedom Summer, of organizing for the Selma marches, not just the first one. The second one is the one that actually made it to Montgomery. So it's those signs, it's the buttons, it's the shared sense of struggle that the material culture can create. It raises money. It helps organizations work together. So this was created by SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinated Committee, founded at Shaw University, just about an hour away from where I live, at Shaw University's founded in Raleigh, North Carolina. Did y'all know Martin Luther King ran for president? Yeah. So yeah, we can learn about the movement by objects like this. So it's just a little tiny lapel-sized button. But it also it helps us kind of envision this important moment. He was a candidate for president when he was assassinated. But for those living in the movement at this time, they have to now, after his assassination, the champion of nonviolent resistance is murdered by a white supremacist. So what do you do now? What are the objectives of the civil rights movement now? Are they the same? At the time of his assassination, Martin Luther King began to help shift those goals. Look, the civil rights movement should really be more about poverty, about ending the war in Vietnam. And material culture was important to shaping those new goals. And particularly after his assassination, what are the goals of the civil rights movement now? Are they the same? Have they shifted? Have the tactics and strategies changed? Do they have to change now that Martin Luther King has been killed? So this is not the beginnings of um, multiple strategies in the civil rights movement, but certainly as a result of his assassination, as well as the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. What we see in the movement after 1968 is sort of a prism, a fracturing. There are those that are saying, look, the best way, now that we have the Voting Rights Act, is to use the system to change the system. We'll do it through electoral politics and campaign buttons and signs and posters and canvassing. There are also those that are saying, look, let's keep up the strategy that has worked so far. And there are also many that are saying, hey, look, what about if that still isn't working? So let's campaign. Let's create posters. Let's canvass. Let's go door to door. Let's use the Voting Rights Act to get candidates elected that support the cause of civil rights. And material culture is there to support that. Many people are saying, look, let's not wait for that. So far, what has worked is protest, advocacy, marches, direct action, nonviolent civil disobedience is what has worked. So let's continue that strategy to advance the objectives of the civil rights movement. And material culture is there helping them do that. But there are also many that are saying that's still not enough. It's not close to enough. We've got the Constitution of the United States on our side. We've got the Supreme Court of the United States on our side saying, look, segregation is illegal. We've got the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, saying efforts to deny us the vote are a federal crime. Racial discrimination is a crime, and yet it is still persisting. So there are many that are saying, look, we have as much of a right to self-defense, armed self-defense, if necessary, to protect those rights that the Constitution guarantees us. So take a look at this photo. Tell me that material culture doesn't matter. I get asked all the time, yes, but it's a digital age now. People are online. People are on their phones all the time. Activism is digital. It's done through social media. And it is, and it should be. Social media should be a part of the strategy of the civil rights movement. But just like that image that we saw at the beginning, showing support in Harlem for the Selma marches, without the signs and the t-shirts and the masks and the buttons, it's people in the street. How do you know why they're there? What this demonstrates, what I hope this presentation and Making the Movement Civil Rights Museum and my book, Making the Movement, illustrates, is that material culture has, is, and therefore always will be a vital component of the movement. I see this as a guidebook, a strategy. Hey, if it's worked, it will continue to work. And for any organization advancing social justice initiatives, material culture has to be a part of that broader strategy. So, how do we tie this to why we're here today? And think about it in context of the National Day of Racial Healing. I got these words from their website. So, what we should be doing in this National Day of Racial Healing, contemplating our shared value, creating a blueprint to heal from the effects of racism, bringing people together to inspire collective action, and build a common ground. Isn't that what we've been talking about? What I've been talking about? Material culture has helped the movement do all of these things from the very beginning. It's helping to facilitate this conversation. It is a part of any organization. Y'all took a poll at the beginning. Hey, this is how I do my advocacy. I'll bet you that organization that you're a part of has buttons or t-shirts or signs or masks or posters. If it doesn't, it should. So, from my perspective, as someone who studies the history of the civil rights movement, and thinking about this notion of healing, that is a tremendous and lofty goal, and it should exist. But healing can only begin after a recognition of past wrongs. Healing is the one of the last steps in the strategy. It's not the first, okay? It's going to take legislative action. It's going to take policy implementation of that legislation. It's going to take an administration that wants that policy to be implemented. And whoever is in power, it will take us to do so. It has to take civic engagement in order to hold leaders accountable. You can't just pass the legislation, everything's good, now we're healing. And it takes things like this: education, outreach, scholarship, museums, exhibitions, difficult conversations in order for the public to understand the goals, objectives of the movement. And from my perspective, material culture will always be a part of that strategy. So thank you for allowing me to pontificate for a little while. I look forward to us continuing this conversation, questions, criticisms that you might have. I think, I hope this is a great way for us to get that conversation going and look towards that ultimate goal of healing and recognition.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, David, for just being able to share what and I think all of us can know is your passion around this subject and more. And, I know when I saw the exhibit in December, as well as just listening to your words, how powerful the information is, and to see it up close and personal, and to also recognize that, this material was it was an actual part of it, and the folks who wore it or the folks who carried it is very powerful, at least for me. Before we, and please write, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I know the classroom that is watching from Dr. Torgano, I asked her if they had questions, just to text them to me, and I would put them in the chat for them as well. Before we move forward with questions, we have one more poll. How do you practice or encourage social justice in your daily work or your life? I invite you the opportunity to reflect about that. And this could be in big and small ways. I think, when movements occur in small, in small notches, there's not one big, in my opinion, one big grandiose event. Even as Dave shared, it's the work in between, and after the big swipes that really move the needle. And so I imagine, whether it's in your hometown, whether you volunteer, whether you write your legislator, make calls, whether you post it on social media, I think about my mother who's going to be 90, and she was advocating for a local magistrate to be elected, and she wore her t-shirt diligently at least once a week and the day of election very proudly. So I know that all of us, who are interested and have the opportunity, take different steps, small and or large, uh, to make the movement persist. If there are no questions or polling responses, I'd like to move on to the first question I have for you as far as the fireside chat, Dave. Um, and I was thinking about as I saw the exhibit in December, and in our conversations, as you gathered the materials and researched your book,
Hmm.
and curated your exhibition, your exhibits, can you share the conversations or the collaborations with prominent figures, or experts in the field that most shaped your work and this collection?
Yes, and thank you for that comment. I did notice how you said made the movement. I really liked that. And I apologize for going a little bit long. That's I can't help myself sometimes. But I had the pleasure and the opportunity of being able to speak with some participants and veterans of the movement about the impact of material culture. This is the first work um, to take this stuff really seriously and to study it in a scholarly and systematic way. When I got started in this work, and I thought that there would just be lots of things written about it, and there was nothing. It was actually Julian Bond, Professor Julian Bond, Chairman Emeritus of the NAACP, who challenged me to turn this into a book. Um, I had the opportunity to travel with him as part of a symposium that he was a part of throughout the South, and we visited sites significant to the civil rights movement. Now, when you travel with someone like Julian Bond, a lot of doors start to open and people want to talk to you. And by this point, I had already founded the exhibition. And, and Julian Bond had seen it when it was a part of an exhibition at Allegheny University, just the second place it had ever exhibited. And he was really taken by it. And when I reached out to him, he remembered it, he understood the significance, and he agreed with me that this was not only significant, it was an understudied aspect of the movement. And he and I were talking to the curator of the Rosa Parks Museum in Montgomery, and she just kind of said, "Hey, do you have a book?" And I said, "No, I've thought about that." And he pulled me aside later, pretty sternly, and said, "You have to do this." He said, if you don't write this book, it's never going to be written. And this story is not going to be told. It took me 10 years to accomplish that mission. And sadly, my friend did not make it there with me. Um, but I fulfilled that promise. And I understood when the people like Julian Bond and John Lewis and C.T. Vivian and Ambassador Andrew Young are telling me, you're onto something here, buddy. It really lit a fire and made me understand that this was significant.
Thank you. And you named some heavy hitters there at the end. It sounds like you had the opportunity to talk to some of those folks.
One of the moments that will always stick out for the rest of my life is in those journeys. Julian and I we ate at Pascal's in Atlanta, still a restaurant that exists, and one that was actually significant to the movement in Atlanta. A lot of civil rights leaders use Pascal's as a way to meet and discuss. So I had the pleasure of having dinner with Julian Bond, John Lewis, C.T. Vivian, and Ambassador Andrew Young, and me sitting at a table with this button on. And the conversations that we had, that bell kept ringing. My heart was coming out of my chest, honestly. Um, but when each one of them were kind of talking about experiences that they had. And you know what? The more that I think about it, and in one of those interviews at Allegheny, you could see Julian Bond's wheels turning. He said, "Oh, we gave those buttons away." And then as soon as he said that, he said, "No, no, 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 no. What am I talking about? We sold them. We used that money." And you could tell that he was beginning to realize the significance. And when people like that are telling me, "You're right," I was like, I have to do this. And I've been doing it ever since.
Thank you for that. And I just learned that I failed to turn on the chat, and I apologize for that. But if you are open to, please use the Q&A feature, and we will make sure your questions and or your comments are heard and recognized. You alluded to the digital age and the comparison, because so you can say, I would ask, even in a digital age, material culture remains vital, as you said. What parallels do you see between past tools like the buttons, the flyers, and today's digital organizing?
And you said you hit on it in the question.
Mhm.
Strategy. It has to be a part of a concerted strategy. Buttons and flyers and posters. That's one tool in your toolbox. Meetings and organizations and marches and sit-ins. That's a part of the strategy. Posting on social media, talking about how you feel, using that as a way to recruit new members and come to the meeting. And that's a part of the strategy also. So it's not an and or situation. It's not like, okay, those buttons are out. Now people meet on social media. It has to be all of that. Um, if you're going to take a picture of a march, well, what are you going to take a picture of? People in the streets? It's people standing there until they have the t-shirts and the buttons and the signs and the posters. That's what you take a picture of and put on your Instagram account. That's what those photos of 100,000 people in the streets of Minneapolis. How do we know they're there? Why they're there? Because they're telling us why they're there. That's why those images are shared. That's why it has a political significance, is because people are in the streets in public, and that's a key component of material culture. It's not artwork to be hung on a wall. That's kind of how we see it now. It has to be worn on a person or held by a person in public for it to have power, for it to be a part of the material culture of the civil rights movement. You have to use it, not just show it. It has to be used in public. That's why it matters.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Um, Going back a little bit, your slides walk us through several eras of the movement. Which era feels most instructive for institutions and for people of today, do you believe, and why?
That's a really, really hard question to answer.
Mhm.
Um, who's your favorite kid? I would say every era used material culture, but every era used material culture in its own way. You're not facing the same challenges in 1968 as you are in 1928 or 1868 or 1988. So it's one of the most important points of making the movement is that the material culture is helping to define and achieve the objectives at the same time. That's a very diplomatic answer. The real answer is pre-World War II. That's the era that inspires me the most. When I think about what activists were up against then, not that every era didn't have its challenges and dangers, but in 1920, there were 2 million members of the Ku Klux Klan. Hard carrying, proud to be there, paid their dues, members of the clan. And there are people walking in the streets with buttons that say, "Stop lynching." What they were risking, this put a target on your chest. And when I think about what they had to go through and the struggle, and they kept going to those meetings and they kept wearing the buttons and they kept holding the signs, and they risked and lost their lives for gains that they never saw in their own lifetime. That hits hard. So if you look, and how does that relate to now? Okay. In those times you think this isn't going to work, these buttons aren't doing anything. Yeah, I held that sign in public. Did it really even do anything? Think about them and what they had to go through to get the progress that did occur. So when you're having those dark moments and you think this stuff isn't working, it is working. You've got to use it as a tool. You've got to use it as a weapon, a nonviolent weapon, just like they do.
What I'm hearing you say is like, number one, there's no particular era, but all the eras matter for that particular moment, right? And I think what resonates even more with me is the fact that, this era, it's our turn to do that. It's to figure out what materials, right? Or what now we have digital age, what we can do to pick up our arms. So, every era has a calling, and we have to figure out what works for us, is what I'm hearing
Yeah,
today.
in the Roman army, they taught every soldier to be able to fight with every single weapon. Because on the battlefield, you don't know if you're going to drop your sword and you need to pick up a spear. You don't know what's going to happen once you're out there. So you use the tool for the right situation, what you have at your disposal. Arguably, we have more tools at our disposal than activists in the past. So pick up the spear, pick up the shield, pick up the sword, fight. You have social media account. You have the ability to organize. You have the ability to host a meeting in your house. You can get in your car and go to a meeting. You can afford a t-shirt and a button. You can afford membership in that organization. So do it. Do it. You've got to get in the fight, or you're not going to win the battle or the war. And we're not going to get to this era of healing without getting some scars.
That's it. Thank you for that. Um, and one final thought or question. How do you think organizations, whether they're education institutions, community organizations, individuals, pursue healing without using it as a substitute for truth telling or action?
Yeah, I mean, healing comes last.
Mhm.
That's the thing is, people love milestones and it's been 50 years and people love to feel comfortable and pat ourselves on the back and I think there is important aspect to that. We should recognize the achievements and how far we've come and all that sort of stuff. But you can get mired in that sort of thing um, pretty quickly. And if you get too focused on, well, you're too focused on, well, things are so much better now. I think we've seen how quickly things roll backwards. That ask Sisyphus, okay? You push that rock up the mountain and you push it and you push it and you push it and you push it. And if you weaken your grip, it can roll right back over top of you and we're going back in the other direction very, very quickly. And I think we've all seen that. So, yes, healing and that is a lofty goal and we should be striving, but we should not lose sight of the stone that we're pushing right in front of us. And we shouldn't fool ourselves about the challenges that are in front of us and the implications of failure. That is something that should focus us. This is a fight, okay? That this is a war against an extremely powerful enemy. Jim Crow is not dead. Those that want it back are not dead. The Voting Rights Act is up for renewal in a few years. Key provisions of it have been gutted since 2013. There are lots and lots and lots, and there are millions of Americans who are not celebrating the victories of the civil rights movement right now. Okay? That's why it's a movement. What do you think all these people are fighting for if there's not tens of millions of people that support it? Okay? So, what in that trip with Julian Baum, we went to Selma. And this was a little over 10 years ago. Man, Selma hasn't changed, I'll tell you. We spoke with a candidate for county commissioner, and he told us vote means victory over the enemy because he's a candidate for county commissioner in Selma. Okay, Selma is just as segregated as it was, maybe more. We went to Selma High School, which was 100% segregated in 2014. We went to a little restaurant in Selma, half a block away from the interpretive center that the Smithsonian was building. They were not happy to see Julian Bond and me walk in with this button. I'll tell you that right now. They dropped our silverware. I didn't eat that sandwich. Let's put it that way. And behind the bar was a helmet from one of the state troopers that beat John Lewis on the bridge within sight of the restaurant. They had it nailed to the back of the bar. So this is a fight, this is a struggle, but we have weapons. It's not violence. Violence categorically is not the answer. It does not work. Strategy works. Material culture works. Organizing works. Changing minds works. So, how are we going to get to that place of healing? We're going to have to fight the war. We're going to have to get some wounds. We're going to have to develop some scars. Then we heal when there's a reason to do so.
Thank you for that answer and the powerful ongoing message that your work continues to sort of pushes us forward. And it reminds me of, continuing the work and continuing the fight of the final essay that John Lewis wrote and was posted on the day of his funeral, I believe, or the day of his death, about, he was passing the torch over and it's now our turn to continue the fight, and
Yeah.
to continue the movement. I'm going to open it up one more time. There hasn't been any questions, and I appreciate you all listening in. And if there are no questions, we do have a final poll before we close that we're going to post. And it's asking, what is one area where you could make meaningful action in the next month? And if you feel comfortable, we hope that you will answer it. And if you're not feeling so comfortable, answer it for yourselves and think about it and letting the question resonate with you. Um, um, and 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 think about what you are going to do or what you would like to do if to move forward. All of the things Dave talked and shared with us today to make this world a more just place for all of us. Because my take is if we make it just for one of us, it's just for all of us. And we need to ensure that, at least from my perspective, that we are doing that for each other for humanity's sake, at the end of the day.
And if I could, and if I may, just interject a little bit about that question. And I liked how you said in the next month, because it's kind of like a New Year's resolution. Oh, I'm going to eat better. I'm not going to drink so much coffee. And then the first week you're having a donut and coffee. Okay. Um, or maybe you last a week and the second week you're doing that. Um, make it immediate. Make it immediate for yourself. Make it personal for yourself. As we've seen, there are lots of ways to get involved. What I would just say is do something. Um, go to a meeting, join an organization, pay those dues, support a candidate, pick a cause. It doesn't have to be racial justice. It doesn't have to be. But do something. One of the most effective things that individual citizens can do is make phone calls. Call your local representatives, your county commissioners, your mayors, your state representatives. Make that phone ring off the hook. I'm telling you, that stuff works. They hate it when that phone will not stop ringing in that real office. Okay? You can find these phone numbers, call 10 people and ask them to call 10 people. 100 phone calls in a representative's office makes a real difference. So there are things that you personally can do now to make a positive change.
Thank you, Dave. Small movements make a difference.
That's
Um,
it.
in, in closing, thanks again, Dave, for sharing your wisdom and your passion and your work with us, and for reminding us that history is not only something we remember, but something that we use. Your work also reminds us that social movements aren't driven by famous speeches or headline moments, but by everyday tools of organizing, communication, for calling to action, and for participating. It challenged us to see civil rights history not as a static memory, but as a living blueprint, one that can guide how institutions and organizations and individuals show up in everyday life. I'd like to give a shout out and thanks to the core team, Savannah Dorsey and Alina Clark, for helping facilitate today's conversation. And again, thank you, Dave, for joining us. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. And have a great rest of your day.
My pleasure, Shalita. Thank you so much.